Hello everybody, Menopause Taylor here, bringing you the state of menopause in the world today and helping you manage your menopause your way. You know how you see someone with a scary mask and something scares you, kind of like the kind of boo type of scare? And you feel fear. That sensation you feel is fear. And of course, it's fear in response to a frightful sight. But have you ever thought about other types of fear? The fear you have to a frightful sight, like a mask, is fleeting. It dissipates instantly, and you forget about it a minute later. But what about fear related to diseases? Or fear related to the consequences of your actions or inactions? How quickly does that type of fear dissipate? Or does it? The topic for today is fear. You know, I talk to you about everything. Yes, I'm a menopause educator, but sometimes certain things are very, very important that sometimes don't seem like they're a part of a topic. But I think fear is a very, very, very important topic. It affects everything you learn about menopause, and it affects everything you don't learn about menopause. It also affects how you use the information you have. It even affects how much you believe facts. And it definitely affects your decisions about how to manage your menopause. So, although you probably don't think of fear as a topic in the arena of menopause, this could be one of the most important podcasts for you. So even if you think you have no fear or don't need to listen to me jabber on about fear, please stay tuned. If you're like most women, you're going to find that the very first step in successfully managing your menopause in any way at all is to understand the effect that fear can have on your menopause management. The kind of fear that affects your menopause is the kind that causes paralysis. I don't mean the kind of paralysis that affects your ability to act. I'm referring to the kind of paralysis that affects your willingness to act. You see, fear is a prison. It imprisons you into a way of thinking that inhibits your ability to consider all your options. So I'm going to present some of the imprisoning fears that affect your menopause management. But before I talk about fear specifically, I want to speak in more general terms about emotions. It is a basic principle of the human brain that we are all pre-programmed to react in roughly the very same way to any stimulus that creates an emotional response. And if multiple humans receive that same stimulus, the collective emotional response becomes very, very strong. If a speaker is addressing an audience, the very, very best way for the speaker to get that audience to agree with him is to evoke an emotional response. Why? Because humans are emotional creatures. And as much as we like to think that we are of higher intelligence and capable of ignoring our emotions when they are illogical, we are hardly ever able to do so. So regardless of whether the speaker is talking to just one other individual or to a crowd of thousands, the very best way to get others to share his or her point of view is to elicit emotion. And even if the emotional response is completely at odds with the facts or the statistics, you will probably listen to your emotions more than you listen to the facts. And this is because communicating facts takes time, and it also takes concentration. You have to pay attention, and people are not good at paying attention. On the contrary, sharing feelings happens instantly. The way one person feels often affects the way others feel. And feelings affect us quickly, automatically, and unconsciously. People convey emotions to one another before they even have the opportunity to think about a situation. So now let's narrow down emotions just a bit. Let's separate them into pleasure and pain. It just so happens that these two emotions, pleasure and pain, are dictated by the law of approach and avoidance. Have you ever heard of the law of approach and avoidance? It's really, really simple. It states that we approach things that bring us pleasure and we avoid things that bring us pain. In other words, we move toward pleasure and away from pain. This is a bias that is hardwired in the human brain. But there's more to it than just approach and avoidance. If you associate something with pleasure, not only do you approach it, you also act on it. For example, let's say you're starving to death. If I stand at the top of a hill and shout, "I have food for you," you will want the food. The food represents something that will bring you pleasure. So you want to approach it. But in order to approach it, you have to climb the hill. Well, because the food represents a reward, not only will you want the food, you're willing to climb a hill to get it. So in addition to making you want the food, I can actually get you to do something in order to get the food. In other words, I can induce you to act on the positive emotion of pleasure. So any emotion that is positive gets people to go out of their way to obtain whatever is associated with the positive emotion. But let's change the situation a bit. Let's say that just like the first example, you're starving to death. And just like the first example, I stand at the top of a hill and shout, "I have food for you." But this time, let's say that you have heard that walking up a hill will cause cancer. You have no proof that walking up a hill will cause cancer, but hearing it scared you. And now you avoid walking up hills. So instead of simply feeling pleasure at the presence of the food, you feel pain at the possibility of getting cancer. So what do you think happens? Do you think it's human nature to climb the hill because you're starving, and if you don't climb the hill, you're starved to death regardless of the possibility of getting cancer? The logical reaction would be one in which you use your brain to think about the alternatives. If you don't climb the hill, you are going to be dead very soon due to starvation. And if you do climb the hill, you may or may not get cancer, but you won't die right away. Well, here's the kicker. The human brain is built to associate action with pleasure, not pain. In other words, walking up the hill is great when it's associated with a reward, but your brain is equally designed to freeze when it senses pain. So in this example, in which you fear cancer from walking up the hill, as much as you want to believe that you'd do the logical thing and walk uphill to save yourself from starvation, psychology shows that you would freeze. In other words, fear inhibits action. So this law of approach and avoidance is about your tendency to act only when something will bring you pleasure, and to freeze or fail to act when something might bring you pain. And the facts just don't matter if you're afraid. The fear takes over. It prevents you from even considering the logic. Now, the way this plays out in terms of marketing is that anyone who wants you to do something will entice you with something that you equate with pleasure. And anyone who wants you to avoid doing something will scare you with something you equate with pain. So let's apply these principles to menopause. You see, you are the victim of all sorts of information, most of it from people who want to benefit from your actions or inactions. By understanding how they appeal to your sense of emotion, you'll know why they use the tactics they use in order to get you to do what they want you to do. So let's start with menopause itself. Has your life experience caused you to regard menopause as something associated with pleasure or pain? See what I mean? I'm going to guess that until you found my menopause education, you probably thought of menopause as undesirable, painful, or miserable. And all those emotions are negative. And collectively, they probably made you fear menopause. And what did I just tell you about fear? Fear induces you to avoid action. So, did you eagerly get the education you needed despite the fear? Or did you delude yourself into thinking it would never happen to you and stick your head in the sand? Remember the podcast I presented on denial of menopause? The reason women are in denial of menopause is because they're afraid of it. That fear causes them to freeze, and they do nothing. My goal is to educate all women so that they can realize that menopause can be the best part of their lives. You can control everything by choosing options that suit you. I'm hoping that associating menopause with pleasure will get them to act and get this education. Okay, what about estrogen? When you hear people talk about estrogen, do they imply that estrogen is good or bad? Do they make you believe estrogen is your friend or your enemy? Do they say that estrogen is what makes you feminine, soft, well lubricated, vibrant, witty, strong-boned, youthful, and free of heart attacks? Or do they tell you that estrogen is dominant and that it causes all sorts of diseases? Do they tell you that estrogen prevents heart attacks, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's? Or do they tell you that estrogen causes breast cancer? I'm going to bet that you hear more of the fear-based things about estrogen. And even though logically you know that you felt and functioned much better with estrogen than without it, you probably reacted more in accordance with the fears. You probably didn't stop to think, hey, wait a minute. My body has loved estrogen all these years. When did it go from being my favorite friend to my greatest enemy? And you didn't think about that because you froze. The fear paralyzed you, so you did nothing. But then, the progesterone pushers realized that you feared estrogen, and what did they do? They seized upon your fear and decided to benefit financially from it. They told you that estrogen dominance was the reason for all your menopause problems, and that progesterone was the cure. Even though progesterone has always made you feel yucky,